You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
If your family WhatsApp group is anything like mine, it can be pretty hectic. Multiple generations communicating about everything from birthdays to travel plans, making arrangements for dinners, sharing photos of dogs and memes. And then someone uses the eggplant emoji in the wrong way and it descends into hilarity. Elfy Scott's family WhatsApp group, the one she has with her adult siblings and their parents, is pretty much the same as everyone else's. Except sometimes her mum posts a message like this.
I swear someone has planted an electronic device on me. I've been hearing people making conversations.
In most families, a message like that would be pretty shocking and certainly deeply troubling. But in Elfy's family group chat, it wasn't at all out of the ordinary. In fact, they'd all been aware of the voices their mother heard since they were kids. I'm Mia Friedman and you're listening to No Filter. Journalist Elfy Scott's mum has schizophrenia and Elfy has written a book about it. Because while we've come a really long way in breaking down the stigma of mental health conditions like anxiety and depression, complex mental health issues like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are still often really misunderstood. Over the past few years, there has been tremendous progress in understanding that you can have anxiety or depression and still live a highly productive, happy life. In fact, initiatives like Are You OK Day are actually all about how well people suffering from those conditions can mask them and how important it is to check in with the people that you love because maybe they're struggling with anxiety or depression and you don't even know it. But what about people with schizophrenia? What can their lives look like? Well, you may be surprised. This is what Elfy wanted to explore in her new book, The One Thing We've Never Spoken About. And it all starts with that message from her mum in the family group chat. Elfy, tell me about your mum. Tell me about growing up with your mum.
So what can I say about my mum? I think it's hard to describe a parent like in any concise way, but I would say that my mum is just this incredibly adorable person. Like all of my friends say that she's the cutest person in the world and they're absolutely right.
I don't know a lot of people who would say that about their mum. Why adorable?
She's got this really funny attitude where she's just very open to things. She's very open to having a laugh and like a good experience and hanging out with friends. And she's really social. She wears like funny, loud, colourful outfits.
I love that.
Yeah, I know. She always looks hilarious. Some outfits are great, some outfits not so much.
My kids say the same.
Yes, right, fair enough. And she's just a really lovely, wonderful parent. Like I really couldn't ask for a better mum. I feel incredibly lucky to have her.
Your parents lived in lots of different countries and your mother is what is sometimes referred to as a trailing spouse, in that the reason they moved from country to country was because of your dad's job. What did he do and what was their life like before you and your siblings were born?
My dad worked in finance, banking industry. I couldn't tell you exactly what he did. But my mum worked as a flight attendant, and that's actually how they met. So back in the late 70s, I believe, there was a competition in Jakarta to pick up flight attendants from Indonesia for Cathay Pacific, and she was one of 20 who was chosen from across the whole country.
It was kind of like a beauty contest back then, wasn't it?
Yes. And she was hot, let's be honest.
Air hostesses, they were called.
They were. And so she was chosen for that, and that's how they met. They actually met on a flight. And then, yeah, my mum's life sort of tracked around the world with my dad for a long time, and she raised kids. She was really, really happy being a mother. She was very excited to be a parent. And they just traveled the world and had like a wonderful time just enjoying themselves and enjoying life, basically.
What brought them to Australia? He was Australian. She was from Indonesia.
So he's actually British, and they came to Australia for work, basically. I think that there was a possibility they were going to move to Brazil, in which case I would have ended up being raised in Rio, wouldn't have complained about that. But they came to Australia because of his job and they just sort of settled here.
What was it like for her in terms of, I mean, she wanted to become a flight attendant to get out of Indonesia. Did she have your brother and sister, Maddie and Mike, when she was in these countries? I mean, moving from country to country when you're not the spouse that has the job, it's quite dislocating in terms of friends and networks.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, she seemed to be very happy, particularly in London. I think that was where she felt her home was. And then when they came to Australia, I think she was quite put off by that. I think that was a very dislocating experience for her because she really kind of resented Australia in a way from her experience on airlines. She tells me that, you know, Australians just used to drink all the alcohol on planes and she just hated that part of the culture. So when she came here, she just really didn't feel at home. And I don't think that she was sort of culturally accepted here as much as she had been in other places.
Tell me a little bit about that. Was she able to make friends? She had little kids. You were then born after she arrived. What was that like? What did she experience when you were younger?
My mum has been fantastic in the sense that she has built a very strong community. So she has had these friends. It's a group of like 30 women who I've known for my entire life who are all Indonesian and who do share her experience. But outside of that, I think it was probably quite difficult for her to make friends. And she did allude to that at one point in the interviews where she said, you know, I was trying to make friends with people through my dad's work and things like that, but it just wasn't clicking and we just didn't stay friends for very long. So I do think that it was quite an alienating experience for her.
When you said interviews, to write your book, did you like formally sit down and interview her? And how did you structure that?
Yeah, that was a weird experience actually. So obviously I've been interviewing people for so long and then I reached out to her and I said, you know, can we do these interviews properly and I'll, you know, set up a camera and, you know, we'll talk. And I didn't formally structure them so much. We sort of looked through photo albums and things like that, and that's how I kind of put things together. But it was a very interesting experience. I think interviewing somebody formally who you are so close to is very strange, and it was a very fascinating experience from the start.
I was thinking about that because, you know, when I asked you to describe your mum, like children are very generally incurious about their parents, right? Like they exist for us to fulfill our needs. We're not really interested in them as people, and we also don't have anyone else to compare them to except, I guess, the parents of our close friends. But even then, you don't really see the full unvarnished truth of what your friends' parents are like.
Totally.
Did you ever get a sense of, oh, maybe my mum is a little bit different to my friends' mums or to my relatives' mums?
Yeah, I always had that sense, but it's quite hard, you know, because obviously I was comparing somebody who was very culturally at odds with all of my friends' parents. So most of my friends growing up had white parents, and I always just thought my mum was, you know, a bit culturally different, but then also like just a bit eccentric and a bit funny about things. And that was never an issue so much as it just was something that I picked up on over the years. And I totally know what you're talking about. I think that there is a certain unknowability to parents, and to hear their stories in depth is very strange because, yeah, you do see them as these figures rather than humans or people who had histories before they had you. So that was really illuminating, and it sort of fit a lot of puzzle pieces together as well.
When did you first start to maybe wonder if she might be unwell?
I don't remember necessarily thinking to myself, oh, there's something terrible happening here. But I do remember there was this point where I went into my parents' bathroom when I was about like 13 years old, I think. And I started rifling through their medicine cabinet and I found her medication, and I can't remember the name of it now, but I did look it up. I Googled it or Ask Jeeved it or whatever was happening when I was like 13. Yeah. So I looked it up and I started to sort of vaguely understand what her condition was and what I had been living around. But up until that point, yeah, I guess I was fairly incurious about it and just sort of accepted it as part of my universe.
When you looked it up, did the word schizophrenia appear?
Yeah, so schizophrenia and psychosis. And I remember I had this friend who was my best friend in primary school, and I asked her to help me research it. And I remember her words very clearly because she called me on my home phone. We were doing this like little Harriet the Spy investigation. And she called me and she was like, oh, it's a medication for crazy people. And I was like, I don't really understand that. I don't know what you're talking about because my mum's not crazy. But I guess I had very little understanding or knowledge of mental health up to that point anyway.
The word schizophrenia is a fairly confronting one, no matter what you know or don't know, but particularly for a 13-year-old. Did you even know what it meant? Like, had you heard it? Psychosis, did you know what those things even were?
No, not at all. And I had very little understanding even into high school. So I was told officially by my school counsellor, and this is a bit opaque, but I think what must have happened was my dad told my counsellor to communicate it to me, which is a bit roundabout. But after that, I started researching things in more depth. I spent a lot of time on the computer, a lot of time on Wikipedia, just like Googling mental health conditions and coming to understand what they were. I think that was kind of why I ended up doing a psychology degree as well, because it was just something that I formed this really strong passion and interest in, and I just wasn't receiving any sort of education outside of that at all.
Did you go to your dad and ask him?
I don't remember doing that. I don't think I did. And I think I must have just felt really uncomfortable talking about it. I mean, I was close to everybody. I was close to my sister and my brother, and they must have known, but I never asked them about it. And I think that that's a pretty strong signal in itself about the stigma that still surrounds it.
When you look back after hearing those words, you know, you talk about puzzle pieces, what can you see up until that point and around that time that might have been explained by that diagnosis and that word?
It's interesting. The experience of living with my mum who has schizophrenia, I mean, for a start, I want to point out that schizophrenia is an incredibly varied condition, and people can have anywhere on the spectrum of experiences, and it can be very severe, it can be not so severe.
See, I didn't know that before reading your book. I thought that there was only one type of schizophrenia or one speed of schizophrenia, and it was not life-ending, but basically completely life-disrupting.
Yeah, so that is not necessarily true. When I was growing up, you know, I noticed my mum speaking to people who weren't there. I noticed there were certain times where she'd grab like a kitchen broom and like started smacking the walls with it and things like that because she heard voices, and she would speak aloud to people and go and try and find the sources of those voices. But it was never something that like was particularly disturbing or distressing.
Like when that happened, what did you and your siblings and your dad do? How did everyone behave?
I think there was a lot of ignoring of it to some extent, or like maybe a little bit of trying to dismiss it in a way, like say, oh, it's just your voices. Like, don't worry about it, Ma, it's just your voices. Like, it's not happening. It's not real. So it
didn't feel scary.
No, it was just something we sort of like ignored a little bit or like shifted away. It wasn't something that we brought in. And I think that that is one of the strangest and maybe like deepest regrets that I have about being a child and not knowing about the condition, in that we couldn't understand it enough to say, you know, it's okay, it's going to be fine. Like, we know what you're experiencing. These are just hallucinations. We didn't have that language. So it was just something that was there. It was never something that was particularly traumatizing or dark or distressing. It was just in our household.
When you interviewed your mum and asked her about the first time she started to hear voices, when the hallucinations or the, you know, bouts of psychosis started, what did she tell you?
So she first started to experience the symptoms of schizophrenia when she moved to Australia. So she moved into this big house that my parents still live in, and she felt uncomfortable in that house. I had these two younger siblings. She was very stressed out by that. She had a baby and a toddler wandering around. She was overwhelmed. And she said that one day she was praying, because she is a Muslim, and she was praying on a mat in her study, and she just started to hear, I believe it was a woman's voice at first, saying things like prostitute or whore to her, like things that were cruel and mean, basically.
So not like a chatty voice going, hey.
No, it was definitely something that like felt oppressive and
frightening, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, she even just felt hurt by what the voices were saying as well. She told me that because she's always thought of herself as a very good person. She is a very good person and, you know, morally upstanding, you know, and when these voices started to tell her things that were cruel, those really hurt her feelings. And so she didn't tell anybody about those voices for a couple of years, I believe. And they sort of just started to spiral a little bit out of control. Like she would hear them. She would call the police and say that they're intruders in the house, things like that. So, yeah.
She must have been scared.
Yeah, I imagine that she really was.
Did she feel like she was going crazy, or did she have a self-awareness enough to know, oh no, if she called the police, she truly believed there were people in the house, right?
Yeah. And I mean, that is a big part of schizophrenia for a lot of people, is whether or not you have that insight into what is happening. And I think that that's something that you can develop over time in conjunction with a psychologist or a psychiatrist. You speak to them and they can give you a bit more understanding of what's a hallucination or a delusion and what is actually coming from reality. I don't believe she had a lot of insight into her mental health condition for a few years until she started seeing somebody quite regularly, a psychiatrist, about 3 times a week, basically.
Who was the first person she told?
I think it was my dad. She said it was my dad. And she said that it was actually when she was pregnant with me that things started to escalate. And so she said there was one night that she explained to me where she was sitting on the sofa and she was next to my dad and they were watching TV. And then she just had this like onslaught of voices just like coming at her. And she like whipped around to my dad and she was like, "What was that? Can you hear that? Who's in the house?" And he was like, "There's nobody here." So I think that that was really the starting point where they understood what was happening and they got the psychiatric help that they needed.
What did that look like? Hospitalization?
No. So my mum was never hospitalized. She just went and saw a psychiatrist about 3 times a week. She went and she formed long-term relationships with psychologists and psychiatrists. I believe she's been seeing the same one for about 20 years now. So yeah, that was really her journey to recovery, and she was medicated quite quickly and diagnosed quite quickly. So she's just been sort of living with it as part of her reality for a very long time.
Has the medication helped?
Yeah, absolutely. So mum's condition sort of comes in waves, really. So there are parts of her condition which will sort of crop up from time to time. So at the beginning of the book, I explained there was a hallucination where she felt that she had a microchip in her brain. And
you start with a group text message of your family. And can you remember what she said in that text message?
Yeah, so she said that she thought that somebody had implanted a microchip in her brain, which is not an uncommon delusion, actually. And she said, you know, she was worried about who had put it there, why they had put it there. And those sort of things do crop up occasionally.
How did you and your siblings, like, what was the reaction in the group?
Again, it was my brother saying, you know, "It's just your voices, Mum, like, don't worry about it. It's not real." But at that time, so that last one was about 5 years ago, I believe. And there were other things that were happening at that point around her medical treatment and things that she had said about like cognitive tests and things like that that were sort of vague to us. So we sort of stepped in with her psychological treatment for the first time. So I went with her to her psychiatrist, which I'd never done. And I was like 25, I think. That was a really interesting experience.
What about your dad?
Dad has always, he's always been supportive, but I think that he himself is a little bit anxious around it. So I understand that, but he's always been incredibly supportive and he's always, you know, looked after Mum, sent her to her appointments, but he doesn't want to intrude, I don't think, as well.
That's interesting. I've since learnt that all siblings have separate group chats away from their parents.
Oh, yeah. No, they do.
My children do. And so I imagine, you know, that's happening in the family group chat. She's saying, the chip's in my brain, I don't know how it got there. So does that then fire up the sibling group chat where it's like, okay, what are we going to do?
Yeah, that fires up the group chat with my brother and sister, but mostly me and my sister who are talking about it. I mean,
how surprising.
You know how women tend to take on the burden of care. So, yeah, that was really a case of my sister sort of pushing me to get myself involved. And the other thing is my mum is a very private person as well. So,
and even her psychiatrist said that to you when you first went there.
Totally. He was like, yeah, she doesn't tell me a lot about her life.
She's like, she has a daughter. I didn't know that.
Yeah, exactly.
Who are you?
Yeah. I'm like, oh, hi, I'm 25 years old. I've been here for a while. But, you know, it was a case of like not so much that nobody wanted to intervene. It was more just like a respectful thing where we wanted to let my mum have her own life and her own world. And obviously, unless you are experiencing symptoms in a very severe way where people feel like they need to intervene in order to keep you safe, there's no reason for other people to go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist appointment with you as an adult.
Yeah.
So that was the first time really that I wandered into an appointment with her.
What made it feel different to you and your brother and sister that you needed to get involved at that stage 5 years ago?
There was news that we had had from Mum in this very scattered way where she said that she had to do a cognitive test where she had to draw the numbers of a clock. I don't know if you've ever heard of this before, but it's quite a common test, I think, just for basic cognitive ability. And she drew the numbers of the clock in the wrong direction. And so I think that that was a fairly strong indication to us that something was a bit amiss. Maybe her symptoms were flaring up and maybe somebody needed to actually accompany her to her appointments. And also, you know—
How did she feel about that?
She was fine. You know, I think she was a bit grumpy at first because she just doesn't like people being in her business and like, I get that. But she was actually happy as well, I think. There was a part of her that wanted to talk to me about these things and I feel that there was some sort of barrier to it. So, you know, I started driving around with her a bit more to appointments or taking her places, and she would talk to me in the car. And that was really how we started to open up our conversation about it. She would say things like, oh, you know, if I was back in Indonesia, I wouldn't have anywhere near the level of care that I do here, and things like that. And just these parts of her life that were quite illuminating, especially as to her struggle behind the scenes, which I'd never known about before.
When you came to the appointments and started having those conversations with her, is she ashamed of her schizophrenia, of her mental health?
I wouldn't say that, and I don't get the sense from her that she is ashamed. I think that one of her biggest concerns, and something that she spoke about with me during the interviews, was that she felt shame in the sense that she was worried that she had negatively impacted our lives. And that was the biggest thing for her, that she was really worried. And this was actually something that cropped up in the first phone conversation I ever had with her about the book. But she said, I'm really sorry if this has affected you or traumatized you. And I was like, it just hasn't. Like, we have a fantastic parent. We have fantastic parents. And I don't think that there's any reason for her to have those feelings, but I understand them at the same time.
Have you felt ashamed?
About my mum? No, never. No.
You spoke about the fact that when you've experienced your own mental health issues around disordered eating, around anxiety, you could talk about those freely with your friends, but you never felt that you could talk about your mum and her voices or her schizophrenia. Maybe shame isn't the right word, but why is that? Looking back now, why do you see the difference there?
It's really hard to try and explain this feeling to people who haven't experienced it. And I think that stigma is very interesting in that way, in that it is kind of elusive and nebulous. It's really hard to sort of grasp why you feel like you can speak about some things, but you can't speak about others. And while I was growing up, I was diagnosed with depression quite early. I think I had my first depressive episode when I was like 14. And I always felt like I could speak about that. But when it came to schizophrenia, like, it's such a scary word. Like, it's a weighty word. And I feel like it's still not there in public dialogue at all. And I think very rarely will people say the word schizophrenia out loud to one another as an objective or neutral fact.
Usually you just hear about it in terms of crime reporting.
Totally.
Or people who are speaking in desperate terms about a loved one.
Yes.
Because there's been some massive crisis or tragedy.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it just exists under the surface, or it exists as a slur as well, because people will say things like, you're so schizo, or you're acting schizo, and that's like still a commonly used word. And to try and speak about schizophrenia as a young person, especially who didn't feel knowledgeable about it, it just had this like weight to it, this burden or darkness that I felt like I couldn't burden other people with, basically.
Did you also feel protective of her? Like, no, but she's not like that thing that's painted in the media and what your preconceptions of what schizophrenia is like. This is my mum. She's my beautiful, adorable mum.
Yeah, absolutely. I also feel like that even to some extent now speaking about it, because I don't want people to have this preconception and not be able to break through. And, you know, it's funny, I used to write a lot when I was younger. So I started out as a columnist for like crappy magazines when I was like 19 years old. And
Same.
Oh, great.
I wasn't columnist though. I was bloody work experience. You must have been a much better writer than I've ever been.
No, I was not. I used to write about all these taboo topics, or what I thought were taboo topics, you know, like being edgy 19-year-old or whatever it was. And I always felt like that was just a topic that was completely off limits. I would never, ever speak about my family. I would never speak about my family's experience. And it took, you know, even up until 2 years ago to feel as though I could publicly start sharing it, which in itself, it's a really strange thing to try and wade through what is stigma, what is trying to protect people, what's privacy, what's just the emotional sort of burden or consequence of talking about something. So it's very tricky and it's very sticky to talk about. But I think that ultimately I came to this point because I wanted to be able to talk about my mum's specific experience and then also shine a light on the experience of so many Australians who are living with this condition.
After the break, Elfy talks about some of the people she spoke to for her book who had very different experiences with schizophrenia to her mum. Some of the people that you spoke to and the stories that you told in the book, because it's not just about your mum. I want to ask you about a few of them. I want to start with Cameron, Jay and Maria. Can you tell us a little bit about their stories?
Yeah, absolutely. So these are sort of 3 stories that I cover in one specific chapter of the book, and that is talking about the experience of stigma as somebody who lives with a complex mental health condition. So Cameron is an advocate. He works at SANE, which is a mental health organisation. He is absolutely fantastic. He's such a nerd, but we really get along. And he's in his 40s. And, you know, he is a really interesting case study in that he was always working as like a corporate professional. I'm not entirely sure what his job was, but he tells me he worked at ANZ for a very long time. And he is just somebody who was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was in his early 20s. And he took up the role of advocate because he felt like when that happened, his world just fell apart. And it wasn't even necessarily because of the symptoms or what life is like living with a condition like schizophrenia. His life fell apart because he didn't have friends anymore. And so many of them pulled away from him because his condition was so stigmatized.
Stigmatized, or was it his behavior as well?
He tells me that actually it's not so much his behavior because he's had his symptoms under control for a very long time. And actually he says things like he can't express anger in social situations anymore because if people know that he has schizophrenia, that's so much scarier for them to see an angry person who lives with this condition. And Cameron has a son who is very young, and he says, you know, I want to be able to destigmatize this condition because what I know based on genetics is that maybe he has a genetic vulnerability to this. And if he turns 14, 15, 16 and he starts to exhibit these symptoms, I don't want his world to fall apart in the same way that mine did. So he is somebody who feels isolated, but he also feels like he has this massive cause to talk about. And he's an incredible crusader. And then as far as Jay and Maria are concerned, both of those case studies are people who live with bipolar disorder, and both of them have experienced psychotic symptoms in the past, Jay in a more ongoing way. And they're people who feel really isolated in their communities. Maria works in a highly professional field, I guess you would call it. I don't know. Corporate, yeah. And she can't tell any of her colleagues about it. So she lives this double life where she understands she would be judged in a negative way.
How do the symptoms manifest for Jay and Maria?
So Jay has bipolar type 1. So he has...
What's the difference between bipolar and schizophrenia?
Bipolar and schizophrenia, it's interesting. So there are two types of bipolar, and bipolar is very much defined by changes in mood. So we might know them as manic depressives. That was the term that was used in the past. And so they're people who experience mania and depressions, highs and troughs of emotion. And it's not necessarily the same diagnosis as schizophrenia. It isn't. It's quite distinct. But, you know, there are some symptoms that can meld into each other. Mm-hmm. And for people who live with bipolar type 1 particularly, they can experience psychosis in much the same presentation that somebody living with schizophrenia can. Yeah.
Do Jay and Maria and Cameron, do they all experience elements of psychosis but they keep them under control?
Yeah. So Jay has ongoing hallucinations. He has hallucinations of people trying to break into his bedroom at night. He sees shadowy figures and things like that. But the rest of his condition really is under control, and he lives a fairly unassuming life. He works as a musician. He's a traveling musician. He's fantastic. He manages bands. Like, he's incredibly successful. These are pseudonyms, by the way, for Jay and Maria. They're a bit younger, and I feel like for younger people particularly, it can be a bit more difficult.
See, it's interesting you telling these stories about these people functioning in society, because my preconceptions about schizophrenia is that it's a very volatile illness that makes things like being employed, being in a relationship, being housed really, really challenging, if not impossible. So you're saying essentially that they walk among us, like in the same way that people who are diabetic and people with anxiety are walking down the street. You can't tell by looking at someone what their mental health condition is.
Yeah.
It's part of that whole idea of what's hidden.
Totally. And, you know,
internal.
Yeah. And I think that that is like a very big misconception about schizophrenia and other complex mental health conditions. Like, they all exist on a continuum. And people's experience of schizophrenia can be that they can't work and that they can't function necessarily in a social setting, and that they sort of drop
and that
out
they'll
from
be
family.
Homeless, and that they'll be muttering in the street, and that they'll have big outbursts and they'll be, you know, in quote marks, crazy.
Yeah, yeah. And look, I think that in many ways our understanding of schizophrenia is defined by people who have those
At the extreme.
very extreme experiences. Exactly.
I want to ask you about Maureen, which is a particularly heartbreaking story that you tell in the book. Can you talk about her story?
Yeah, so Maureen reached out to me probably about a year ago, I think, via email. She is an ex-journalist. She's 93. She is shockingly smart, intelligent. You know, she still has a full social life for a 93-year-old. I saw her for lunch the other week. She's incredible. She's still driving. And I went over to Maureen's house because she said that she had a story to tell about her children. And in fact, what she told me was this really incredibly sad story about how she felt she had essentially lost all three of her children to a complex mental health condition. She first told me about Simon, who was her son, and he was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a young man. And essentially, he really struggled. They tried to give him the best help that they possibly could. He ended up being hospitalized multiple times. And he was this fantastic, creative, sensitive, caring young man. And they just could not save him ultimately. And he ended up taking his own life when he was, I believe, 22 years old. And she showed me photos of him, and he was just so gorgeous. Like, the children were just so gorgeous together. And a couple of years after he died by suicide, his younger sister, Sarah, started exhibiting symptoms as well. And ultimately, Sarah had a very shocking ongoing struggle as well with schizophrenia well into middle age. And she actually passed away recently as a result of a medical condition that was associated with her reliance on smoking, because a lot of people with complex mental health conditions will rely on smoking a lot. There is something about the interaction with nicotine that does seem to alleviate symptoms for some people. But regardless, yeah, it was incredibly sad. And Maureen tells me Sarah was this artistic, beautiful girl. She tells me that she was so good as a child and she never had any problem with her. And she was like really good friends with this gorgeous, gorgeous woman. And unfortunately, her life was cut short by way of her mental health condition and the fact that she couldn't care for herself physically.
What makes people develop schizophrenia?
It's a very, very complex question, and I am by no means a professional. But what I have come to understand is that generally it's thought that there are genetic predispositions. So schizophrenia and bipolar disorder will appear in family trees very often together. But with that genetic predisposition, it can be set off. I don't know if that's necessarily triggered. Yeah.
Activated.
Yeah, exactly. By certain events in people's lives. There's a lot of stuff that's associated with it statistically.
What kind of thing?
There are things that have appeared in the studies like exposure to lead, the month the child is born in, things like
marijuana.
That. Marijuana, yes, absolutely. Marijuana use and trauma is a really, really big one. So for a lot of the people who you speak to who live with complex mental health conditions, they will say that they have experienced some trauma at some point in their lives, particularly childhood trauma, very much increases the likelihood that somebody will be diagnosed later in life.
And if your parent had it, how do you and your siblings feel? Do you think you might develop it? Do you think it might be in you already?
For me, specifically?
I mean, there's no genetic test for it, is there? There's no screening.
No, that's the thing, exactly. Like schizophrenia is not something that will show up in an MRI or a blood test or any sort of physical test. So it's impossible to say, really. Like, you don't know. And I think that it's something that I talk about in the book, but it's something that I've had to grapple with in the sense that I have wondered for a long time about whether or not I will develop schizophrenia, where mum's schizophrenia came from, trying to like put these threads together. And at the end of the day, I just have to concede that like it's kind of irrelevant to some extent. Thinking about these things, it's pointless. It's a fruitless exercise. And all I can do really is try to talk about the experience of people living with schizophrenia and try to say how or why their care should be improved and why society should be able to talk about it more openly.
What care do we offer? What is the treatment for those people at the extremes? What does it look like in the mental health system?
Yeah, so like you say, the care of complex mental health conditions used to be incredibly reliant on institutions. And then we saw increasing deinstitutionalization in the past 50, 60 years. And basically what that looks like now is that there is an attempt to treat people in the community with community-based care. I should note that the institutions were never actually closed. So there are still a lot of psychiatric institutions open in Australia, especially. And, you know, people will be institutionalized for indefinite periods, and that's still something that happens. But outside of those buildings, we have community-based care where people will be treated with psychologists, psychiatrists, but the mental health care system is incredibly opaque. It's incredibly tricky to try and understand. And I think for anybody who has tried to navigate it, I mean, you would understand that, especially having to try to visit psychologists and get a diagnosis. Like
at a time when you are unwell.
It's incredibly hard. And, you know, there are community-based services as well, like social services that will try and connect services for people who are struggling. And social workers, community workers, they all exist, but they exist in this very sort of scattered capacity. And ultimately what I draw in the book is that our mental health care system is very weighted towards emergencies. And basically, a lot of people will be existing out there struggling with their mental health conditions. And the only time that they receive acute care that wraps around them for a short period of time is when they end up in emergency rooms in hospitals. So there is a mental health care system, but whether or not it actually fulfills its need in terms of complex mental health conditions is very questionable, and a lot of people fall through the cracks.
Just finally, I have a confession. When I was preparing for this interview, I went deep diving on your Insta.
Oh, God.
Looking for a picture of your mum. I really wanted a face in my mind while I was reading about her and while I was reading your book. I looked and I went back to about 2014. My thumb was sore. I was scrolling. I found one of her with you when you were a little girl, like 2 or 3.
That is a very cute photo. I love that photo.
But other than that, nothing. Is that a deliberate decision? Is she a private person? Are you protective?
Yeah, I am really protective of mum, and especially when I knew this book was going to be published, we made the decision that her photo wouldn't be published anywhere. And so I think for any press that's happening around it, we'll have to, obscure her in some way, those things. So I do try to keep her face out of the spotlight, especially because I think that for anybody who doesn't work in media, it can be incredibly hard to understand the ramifications of what it means to have your face out there.
Yeah.
Like, you're somebody who has your face out there. Yeah.
But not my kids.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. And I think that that's an important decision. And I think that you really have to be able to sort through what that means and whether or not you want to be recognizable, because actually most people don't.
You've done such a service with this book. I learnt so much. I never thought that there were people, I don't know if high functioning is a term that we're allowed to use or that's a term that's still in favour, but this idea that you can have schizophrenia and exist in the world in a very positive way and not have your life completely destroyed by it.
Yeah.
And not impact on others in the way that perhaps we perceive someone with schizophrenia might.
Yeah, and that's really important to recognise, that recovery is possible for a huge amount of people who live with schizophrenia. And what we have to do is ensure that they have the right services, the right access and resources to be able to accomplish that. And, I actually want to also make the point that for a lot of people who I spoke to for this book, many of them were struggling profoundly when I first spoke to them. Many families were struggling profoundly. And in the past few weeks, when I've caught up with people to talk about the book, they've caught me up on their lives. And actually, a large number of them have said, it's gotten better. We're not in the same place that we were a year ago. And maybe it will get worse, maybe it will get better, but I want it to be understood that there are fluctuations, that recovery is possible, and that life can get better past that diagnosis.
Now, if that's brought up any issues for you and if you need support or you know someone who does, remember that Lifeline is always there on 13 11 14. Now, a funny thing happened after we recorded that podcast. Elfy and I got talking about her career as a journalist and a podcaster and a broadcaster and what she wanted to do next now that her book is out in the world. And well, that conversation led to more conversations with our editorial director, Rosie Squires, here at Mamamia, and our head of podcasts, Eliza Ratliff. And I'm delighted to say that in a couple of weeks, Elfy Scott will be joining Mamamia full-time as the editor of our website. She starts in a couple of weeks because she has book promotion to do. This is such a beautifully, carefully written book with so much investigative journalism and so much heart and research, which are all hallmarks of Elfy's work, and we cannot wait to welcome her into the Mamamia team. You can buy her book, The One Thing We've Never Spoken About, right now, and there is a link in our show notes. And we've also put some links to some other resources if you feel like you need some help with any of the issues that Elfy spoke about today. The producer of No Filter is Emmeline Peterson and the executive producer is Eliza Ratliff, with sound production by Maddie Juano. I'm Mia Friedman, and next week, Claire Murphy sits down with everyone's favourite Aussie Idol contestant, Rob Mills. Here's a little bit of a taste.
I was sad. I just got really sad. I was like, why am I so sad? I was like, because you haven't done any work you don't know who you are. It's like everyone has an idea of who you are. People yelling out, Millsy, on the street. You're like, all right, good to see you. Thank you. And the Paris Hilton tag sort of was like hanging over my head everywhere I went, which is just so weird to me. But I was like, I don't want to be just that guy.
Thanks for having me in your ears. Speak soon.